Can trust ever be rebuilt after betrayal? This question tormented me as I uncovered the truth about Tammy's secret life. It was just a mistake, she pleaded, her words hollow against the weight of her actions. The love we once shared now tainted by lies and deceit. I never wanted this to happen, she insisted, but the damage was done. This is my journey through broken vows and shattered dreams. Enjoy watching it. Strong winds were reported on the bridge the morning after we left Bremerhaven, heading back to the States. The storm had moved farther east than we thought, so with 350 nautical miles left to return to Germany, we would need to stop in Portsmouth, England. While it was fine to shelter there in an emergency, it meant we would have to wait in line to leave again. Still, we received the order. Go to Portsmouth and wait to depart later. The Molly Sen, a 260-meter cargo ship registered in Panama, was carrying 6,250 containers of goods, mostly parts and supplies for car factories in the States. This was my 18th trip on the Molly. When we reached Charleston, I would have some big choices to make about my future, with options for retirement and health benefits if I decided to take them. Leaning on the rail on the left side, I watched the harbor master come aboard to guide the Molly into the port. This was a common practice in busy commercial areas. Roger Chafee was the master, and I recognized him from his time working at the harbor in Southampton. He was a good seaman. "Good to see you, Max. Once we're done here, let's get something to eat," he said more as a statement than a question, and I never refused his kind offer. "I wouldn't dream of it," I replied with a laugh. Later that evening, after my second-in-command took over the watch, I met my old friend at the Ferry House Inn. We enjoyed the best fish and chips I had tasted, sharing stories from both sides of the ocean. "So, how's your lovely wife back in Charleston?" he asked after we had swapped numerous tales. I hesitated, and he must have noticed the sadness on my face. He understood. He had been through similar struggles. It was part of life at sea, and he nodded knowingly. "We parted ways a couple of trips back. She found someone else while I was away, I guess," I admitted. "That's hard to hear." He signaled for drinks from the barmaid. "Here's to good women wherever we find them." He was right. I had always thought of Tammy Waters as a good woman for a long time before our situation changed. 6 months earlier. "It feels great to be back on solid ground," I said to my first officer as I pulled my bag behind me. He was headed to Greenville, and we would meet up again in 6 weeks. The crew and another captain were planning a trip to South America and back once the ship was ready. "I can give you a ride, Captain. It's no trouble," he offered, with his wife beside him. I accepted and had him drop me off at City Market. I wanted to surprise Tammy with a dozen long-stemmed white roses, her favorite. We had arrived in port a bit early, and I usually called her when we were a couple of days away to see what she had planned. The area was lively with tourists and students from the College of Charleston, and delicious smells filled the open-air markets and streets around us. I had bought my house in the neighborhood a few years after Hurricane Hugo had hit the city hard. I found a place on Anson Street at a good price. The previous New Jersey owners had decided to leave after the storm damaged their roof, and I was lucky to get it. With hard work, I had restored the house to match the charm of the area. With the help of a skilled blacksmith, I fixed the iron fencing around the garden and street side. Now I had a 3-story pastel pink house with dark green shutters, even if it sat empty most of the time while I was at sea for 10 weeks and home for 6. Then, a couple of years later, Tammy Waters rang my doorbell. I was expecting a new student to rent a room, as one of my previous renters had just graduated. After the house had sat empty for several tours, a friend suggested I rent out rooms to college students. I ended up renting out 2 rooms on the top floor to a couple of girls, and when one graduated, the other would find a replacement. I was expecting the new roommate when I opened the door. "Mr. Bunyan, good afternoon. I'm Tammy Waters. I hear you plan to lease a room to my sister, Patty Waters," she said as I opened the door for her. "Yes, she seems like a lovely girl, and the last renter had great things to say about her," I replied. "I wanted to check it out myself. You can never be too careful nowadays." I offered her a drink, and she surprisingly chose an IPA, which impressed me. I was struck by her beauty. She reminded me of a younger version of a movie star with dark hair and a vibrant personality. She looked around the house, and I gave her a full tour, ending up in the small garden next to the house. I had filled the courtyard with various plants and flowers. The evening light made it a lovely sight. Even though the afternoon sun and heat weren't ideal, she seemed to like it, and I invited her and her sister to dinner the next night. After a few dates, Tammy and I became a couple that enjoyed each other's company but weren't in a hurry to make big changes. Tammy understood my job at sea. Her dad had been in the Navy. She taught fine arts at a college and was close to earning a permanent position. We both loved our city, so it was understood she would stay if she got that chance. Because of this, we settled into our nice routine. For almost 3 years, we were a couple before she decided to move in with me and rent out her little house by the river. By then, I was 35 and worked as an engineer, waiting for a chance to be promoted. It felt a bit strange at first, even though I had rented my home to students for almost 10 years before that, and still did even after she moved in. Before I met Tammy, I had friends who were girls, but I was always respectful around the students living with me. Some people thought that was odd, while others found it interesting. I enjoyed my life, and so did she. We both entered our relationship with experience and had always been happy together. By the time we married, I was 40, and she was 36. We had no plans for children. Tammy couldn't have them for health reasons, which she accepted early in her 20s. Our lifestyles made that decision easy for both of us. Over the years, I admit I faced some challenges. That's just part of my job. I've been to many ports from Charleston to the Orient and even to parts of Russia. There are many women in those places, but I usually stayed away from that kind of attention when I was single. Tammy had her own challenges with many men around while I was away for weeks. We had an agreement. We didn't betray each other because we didn't want to. We could have kept secrets, but we chose to trust each other. One day I walked up Anson Street feeling good about our lives. "Good morning, Mr. Bunyan. Did you have a good trip?" Mr. Shields, my neighbor, asked. His wife had passed away, and he now spent his time growing orchids on his rooftop garden. "Yes, sir. Smooth sailing and great food," I replied, waving as I turned the corner to my home. The latch on the iron gate to my garden was broken and needed fixing, but it still kept the gate closed. I always entered through the back to check the garden first. Tammy parked in front and used the main door, but I preferred my routine. Entering through the back, I found a short hallway leading into the kitchen. I tossed my jacket onto a chair and looked for a vase for some flowers. She had left some croissants on the counter, so I grabbed one and entered the living room, taking off my shoes. It was still a little early for dinner, so Tammy wasn't expected home yet. I went upstairs to change and put away my things. I noticed the toilet seat was up, which was unusual. As I stood there, the smell of the unfamiliar body wash lingering in the steam-filled bathroom, an uncomfortable tightness began to build in my chest. The toilet seat up, a small detail, easily overlooked by anyone else, felt like a glaring anomaly in the carefully constructed routine Tammy and I had established. I had been meticulous about these things, knowing how much they mattered to her. But now, here was a sign that another man, careless in his presence, had invaded my space. I tried to push the thought aside, blaming it on my long absence and the tricks of a weary mind. But the doubts festered, gnawing at the edges of my reason. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the unease swirling in my gut. The logical part of me insisted it was nothing, that perhaps Tammy had simply forgotten to mention a friend's visit. But the irrational part, the part fueled by years at sea and the loneliness that comes with it, screamed that something was wrong. I went about my evening routine, but the suspicion lodged itself in my mind, refusing to let go. As I dressed and headed downstairs, I found myself walking slower, my thoughts heavy with worry. The usual comfort of home seemed distant, as if tainted by some invisible presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had shifted in my absence, that something, or someone, had taken root here while I was away. Before I left for Henry's house that evening, I hesitated in the doorway of the living room, my eyes scanning the room for anything else that might be out of place. Everything seemed as it should be, but that only deepened the sense of unease. It was as if the house itself was conspiring to hide the truth from me. On a whim, I decided to check Tammy's social media. It was something I rarely did, respecting her privacy as I would expect her to respect mine. But tonight, the gnawing doubt pushed me to cross that line. As I scrolled through her posts, I noticed nothing unusual at first. Photos of her artwork, snapshots of Charleston's historic streets, a few selfies with friends. But then, buried among the likes and comments, I found something that made my breath catch. A picture of Tammy at a small, intimate gathering, standing next to a man I didn't recognize. His arm was draped casually over her shoulders, his smile a little too familiar. The caption read, "Catching up with old friends." But I had never heard Tammy mention this man before. The comment section was filled with light-hearted banter from her friends, but one comment stood out, a simple wink emoji from the man himself. It wasn't much, but it was enough to set my nerves on edge. Closing the app, I pocketed my phone and headed out the door. I needed to clear my head, and a drink at Henry's seemed like the best way to do that. But even as I walked down the street, the evening air cool against my skin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between Tammy and me, something that couldn't be undone. At Henry's, I tried to lose myself in the familiar comfort of the bar, chatting with Satch and the regulars, but my mind kept drifting back to the man in the photo, to the upturned toilet seat, to the unfamiliar scent in my bathroom. As the evening wore on, I made a decision. I needed to know the truth. And if that meant setting a trap, then so be it. The next morning, I pretended to head out on an errand, making sure Tammy saw me leave with my bag. But instead of driving to the store, I parked a few blocks away, out of sight, and walked back to the house. I found a spot where I could watch the front door without being seen, my heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and determination. Hours passed, and just as I was beginning to think I had been paranoid, I saw a car pull up. The man from the photo stepped out, casually strolling up to my front door. Tammy greeted him with a warm smile, the kind she used to reserve for me. As they disappeared inside, I felt something inside me snap. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion. It was real, tangible, and it was happening right in front of me. My hands clenched into fists as I realized that the life I had trusted in, the life I had built with Tammy, was crumbling. I didn't confront them right away. Instead, I waited, seething in silence, knowing that the time for confrontation would come soon enough. But when it did, it wouldn't just be about hurt feelings. It would be about revenge. There was also a body wash in the shower with a scent I didn't recognize, which made me wonder if someone else had been using it. The toilet seat had been a joke between us before. I had learned to keep it down after living together, so seeing it up after being away for some time felt odd. I got dressed and went downstairs to check for messages. Putting on a smile, I walked to Henry's house for a drink. It's a local place nearby where I could relax with good drinks and some jazz. My old friend Satch runs the bar and always has a special drink waiting for me. "You look like you've been on an adventure," he joked when I walked in. The regulars were there, but the busier crowd would show up later. "When did you get back?" "You missed my little greeting. I did a few short whistles," I said, and he laughed, thinking I was joking. Satch was known for his looks and charm, and he loved having regular customers. I had been coming to the bar for years, even though some familiar faces had changed over time. "Maximilian's Golden IPA is ready for you," he shouted from behind the bar. My name is actually Maxwell, but I didn't mind his playful twist. "Oh, before I forget, Dave Hoff was here asking about you." Dave used to come in often, but he had personal matters and moved away. He's a good guy, but his ex-wife had her own challenges. "He left a note for you," Satch said, handing me a paper. I opened it while enjoying my beer and found an invitation to a wedding on Lake Texoma in Oklahoma. My laughter could probably be heard all the way outside. "He's marrying his ex's sister, can you believe it?" I said, still chuckling. The wedding was in 4 weeks, and since I had a little time to get ready, it felt manageable. Here's to Dave and his wild new journey. I raised my drink to the small group around me that afternoon. Then I took a sip and turned my thoughts toward my own life down the street. Tammy still hadn't come home by 8 p.m., and I hadn't called to let her know I was back. Instead, I sat in the armchair by the window, looking out at the street and wishing for one of those soft, fluffy cats. We had 2 pets, even though we weren't supposed to. The sidewalk was getting darker when her car arrived and parked a little down the street. I had just finished my second drink since returning home. I had so many questions and worries, and I wasn't sure about any of the answers, especially when I saw them come closer. I thought they would go right into their house, but instead, she hugged the man before he walked to his car parked across the street. I recognized him from before. He was the head of her department. Smart, but a bit out of touch. He was also a good 10 years older than me. I found it somewhat funny. Tammy is very attractive, and if she wanted someone else, she could have chosen anyone younger. But she had picked him. I knew she was fine with money, and I thought I met her needs. I just shook my head and moved toward the door as I heard her come in. She walked in and sighed, seeming grateful to be home after a long day. I remembered the first time we had met there. She looked just as lovely now, but a hint of sadness crossed my mind. She headed toward the kitchen, but then she stopped, surprised. It was getting dark in the room, but I could see the shock in her eyes when her hand went to her mouth. "Oh my gosh, you're back?" she exclaimed, disbelief in her voice. "The horn this afternoon. That was you?" I nodded and looked out the window. She had to know I saw them. How could she not? "Why didn't you call me?" "I wanted to surprise you by coming home early. I guess I should have called." She paused, looking for the right words. "Max, oh no. Thomas, we just had dinner tonight, that's all." She tried to smile, but it was clear she was struggling to keep it together. "Can I assume he paid for dinner and expected more?" "Max, please, it wasn't like that." But we both knew what had happened. "What was it like, Tammy?" Tammy shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting away from mine as if searching for an escape. The casual confidence she had earlier seemed to evaporate under the weight of my question. I could see the gears turning in her mind, calculating the right words to diffuse the situation. But there was no diffusing this. No smooth explanation could erase the gnawing doubt that had settled deep within me. "It wasn't like anything, Max," she finally said, her voice a strained attempt at nonchalance. "He's just my boss, nothing more." But the tremor in her voice betrayed her. I leaned back in my chair, my arms crossed, letting the silence stretch between us. She had to know that wasn't enough, that her vague reassurances wouldn't satisfy me. Not anymore. "Just your boss?" I repeated, my voice low, controlled. "That's funny, because I've never seen a boss send you flowers or call you at odd hours of the night or insist on having private meetings behind closed doors. So tell me again, Tammy, what was it like?" She flinched at my words, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, regret, maybe, or fear. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a steely resolve. "Max, you're blowing this out of proportion," she said, a touch of annoyance creeping into her tone. "He's just a man with a bit too much power and not enough boundaries. I handled it. It's over." "Handled it?" I echoed, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "How exactly did you handle it? By letting him blackmail you? By keeping it from me until I had to drag it out of you? Because that doesn't sound like handling it, Tammy. That sounds like you were afraid." Her face paled at the mention of blackmail, and she opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off. "Don't lie to me, Tammy," I warned, my voice hard. "I know about the photos, the videos. I know he's been holding that over you for months. And you let him, didn't you? You let him control you, manipulate you. It wasn't like that," she snapped, her voice rising as she fought to regain control. "He was. Persistent, yes, but I never let it go that far. I never let him—" "Then why didn't you tell me?" I demanded, leaning forward, my eyes locking onto hers. "Why didn't you come to me, Tammy? We're supposed to be a team, but you shut me out. You let him wedge himself between us, and now look where we are." She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she clenched them in her lap. For a moment it seemed like she might break, that she might finally admit the full truth. But instead she looked away, her voice small and defeated. "I was scared, Max. Scared of what he might do, scared of what you might think. I thought I could handle it on my own, that it would just go away if I ignored it. But it didn't go away, did it?" I said quietly. "It only got worse, and now we're here, in this mess, because you couldn't trust me enough to let me in." She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Max. I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this." I sighed, the anger draining out of me, leaving only a deep, weary sadness. I wanted to believe her, to believe that she hadn't intended for things to spiral out of control. But the damage was done, and the trust between us had been shattered. "Sorry isn't going to fix this, Tammy," I said, my voice heavy with resignation. "I don't know if anything can." She looked at me then, truly looked at me, as if realizing for the first time how much she had lost. But it was too late. The wall between us was too high, too thick, built from months of lies and secrets. "I'll give you some time to figure things out," I said, standing up. "But we both know this isn't something we can just sweep under the rug." As I walked out of the room, I heard her muffled sobs, but I didn't turn back. I couldn't. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted, had betrayed me in the worst way possible, and I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive her for that. She opened her mouth to protest, but deep down, we understood the truth. "I'm going to step outside for a bit. You need to figure things out," I said, feeling heavy-hearted. "Max, please, can we—" I raised my hand to signal the end of the conversation. She seemed upset while I felt heartbroken. I had known the truth all along, but in that moment together, the ache became too much. So I left the house and walked down the street toward the East Bay. I didn't have a specific place in mind, but I was hungry and needed something to eat. I found a spot at the Market Street Saloon and ordered wings and fried mushrooms. I was served by a waitress who gave me the space to think. As I waited for my food, I considered the situation. Thomas Pryor was already married, which should have meant something, but it didn't stop him from showing interest in Tammy. I found it ironic and a little funny, considering Mrs. Pryor was known for being strong and straightforward. Still, the thought of Tammy and Pryor together was a real problem for me. When I got back home, it was unusually quiet. The warm and welcoming home I had known for years felt different. Tammy had taken some things with her, and her car was gone. I noticed some of her items were missing from the bathroom, but I didn't dwell on it. Feeling defeated, I tossed my shirt over the bedpost and fell into a restless sleep. At dawn, I skipped breakfast and decided to take a bike ride to the Battery at the point of the peninsula to clear my mind. The quietness of the place was what I needed, though I knew overthinking could lead to more doubts. Thoughts of what might have happened nagged at me, but I tried to push them aside. The most important issue was the future of my marriage. I didn't want it to end. I had invested so much time and love into it. I wondered if Pryor was the first, or if there had been others before him. These thoughts consumed me as I tried to understand the situation. One thing was clear. I needed to talk to Tammy. Her boss had crossed a line, and she didn't seem to realize how serious it was. This conversation would be important, but I wasn't sure how it would go. Later, I learned that Tammy had gone to stay with her sister, the same sister who had lived with me when Tammy and I first met. Tammy still had her bungalow, and when her sister's marriage ended, Tammy offered her a place to stay. I didn't know if Pryor had visited her there, but that was a conversation for another time. Light rain tapped against the kitchen window as we sat in the now quiet house. Tammy looked good, but also tired, perhaps showing how hard this situation had been for both of us. "Max, this isn't what I ever wanted. Please believe me." "What did you want, Tammy?" I asked, trying to understand her feelings. She struggled to find the right words, and I couldn't blame her. I can't imagine what it would be like to be in her position. "Is Pryor what you really want?" She gave a dry laugh, her face showing many feelings. "No, we can't work together now. It was a mistake, Max, one I can't defend." "But you were still seeing him this week?" I asked, trying to get more details. "No, Max. I ended it completely the night I left. I called him from the bungalow. He didn't want to end it, but when I said I would tell Sophie, he backed off." I thought about Sophie and almost smiled at the idea. "Why him, Tammy? I just don't get it." "I don't know. He kept pushing me, reminding me of everything he did for me. He was there when I felt lonely, and before I knew it, it turned into something more. It felt easy, and I didn't stop it in time. I didn't need to ask anything else. Tammy knew she had made a mistake, and now we had to figure out what to do next, if that was even possible. Now, I've messed everything up, haven't I? I believed her. What happened long before she came to live with me wasn't the issue anymore. But the untruthfulness still stung. I had never done anything like that to her. "Tammy, it's what's happening now that gets to me. Pryor interfering in our lives is something I need to think about. If I can't move past it, I really don't know what will happen." Tears filled her eyes, and I gave her a tissue. After a moment, she spoke again. "I know. That's why I've made a decision I didn't want to make. I'm going to take a 6-month fellowship at the university in Vancouver. It will help me get away from Pryor, and I can keep my position at Charleston. They'll send someone else here in my place." "That was quick. You decided that before we even talked." I didn't plan it, but things have changed, haven't they? Yes, sadly. You know I'm nearing 30 years of service and had choices to make. This makes things difficult. She stayed quiet, but I could see the hurt in her eyes. Oh, and I should have told you earlier, Dave Hoff is getting remarried next month, and I plan to go. He's marrying Torre, Tracy's sister of all people. I didn't expect that. If you're still here, we could put aside our issues for a bit if you want to come. I mentioned it to give her a choice, but it didn't really matter to me. I wish I had known. I'll be in Vancouver by the end of the month. Maybe that's for the best, Max. We left it there and shared a painful hug before she went back to West Ashley. Dave was an old friend from Henry's house, but just having drinks together doesn't always create lasting friendships. Tammy was probably right. Tammy flew out to Vancouver a week after our talk. As I stood at the airport, watching her disappear into the bustling crowd of travelers, a hollow feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. Tammy's departure felt like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage, a cold acknowledgement that whatever we once had was now fractured beyond repair. The week leading up to this moment had been a blur, conversations that went nowhere, apologies that felt empty, and a heavy silence that hung over our home like a thick fog. She had tried to soften the blow, telling me that the fellowship in Vancouver was a prestigious opportunity, one that would elevate her career and give her the space she needed to think. But I knew better. It wasn't just about the fellowship. It was about escaping the tangled mess we had made of our lives, about putting as much distance between us as possible. I had spent that last week teetering between anger and a crushing sadness. I wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, to make her see the damage she was doing, but every time I opened my mouth to speak, the words died in my throat. What was the point? No amount of shouting would undo the past, and no amount of begging would bring back the trust we had lost. The morning of her flight, we barely spoke. She had packed most of her things the night before, her suitcase sitting by the door like a silent testament to the life she was leaving behind. I had watched her move around the house, gathering her belongings with a detached efficiency that made my heart ache. This was the woman I had loved for years, the woman I had built a life with, and now she was slipping away from me, one packed item at a time. When it was time to go, I offered to drive her to the airport. The ride was quiet, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional sniffle from Tammy as she wiped at her eyes. I didn't ask her what she was thinking, and she didn't offer any explanations. The silence was heavy, laden with the unspoken words that neither of us had the courage to voice. At the terminal, we stood awkwardly by the curb, the cacophony of the airport around us. She turned to me, her eyes glistening with tears, but I couldn't bring myself to reach out, to comfort her. A part of me wanted to, but a larger part, the part that was still reeling from her betrayal, held me back. "Max, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I wish things were different, I wish." But she trailed off, her words swallowed by the noise of a passing crowd. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. What could I say? That I wished things were different too, that I wished she hadn't lied, hadn't cheated, hadn't shattered the life we had built together? Instead, I simply said, "Take care of yourself, Tammy." She hesitated as if waiting for me to say something more, but when I didn't, she gave a small, sad smile and turned away. I watched her walk through the sliding doors, her figure growing smaller and smaller until she was just another faceless traveler in a sea of people. As I drove home, the house felt emptier than it had in years. It wasn't just the physical absence of Tammy that made it feel so barren. It was the knowledge that she had taken the last remnants of our marriage with her. The woman who had walked out of my life that morning was not the same woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. That woman was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. But even as I tried to distance myself from the pain, a part of me couldn't let go. I found myself replaying our last conversation over and over in my mind, searching for some clue, some sign that could have warned me of what was coming. How had I been so blind? How had I missed the signs? It wasn't long before I found the answer, buried deep within the messages and call logs on her phone. I wasn't proud of it, snooping through her private life like a jealous teenager, but I needed to know. I needed to understand. What I found made my blood run cold. Messages exchanged between Tammy and Jim Dahlberg, a visiting professor who had been in Vancouver for a research project. The tone of their conversations was far too familiar, the kind of familiarity that only comes from spending intimate time together. They talked about meeting up, about future plans, about things they could only do when I wasn't around. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. She hadn't just left for a fellowship. She had left to be with him. While I had been struggling to keep our marriage afloat, she had been planning her escape, orchestrating a new life with someone else. For a moment, all I could see was red. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined, and the urge to confront her, to confront him, was almost overwhelming. But I forced myself to take a step back, to breathe. I couldn't let anger drive me to do something reckless. Instead, I started planning. If she wanted a new life, then I would give her one, but not in the way she expected. I would take everything she had left behind, everything she thought she could walk away from without consequence, and I would burn it to the ground. But I wouldn't do it right away. No, I would wait. I would be patient, and when the time was right, I would make sure she knew exactly what it felt like to lose everything. We had dinner the night before she left, but nothing much changed. We were separating to give ourselves some space. I didn't make demands, and she didn't offer anything. That last point bothered me the most. We had shared a close bond, and our time apart due to work made our reunions feel even more special. Could I manage 6 months without her? Sure I could, but I wondered if I would want to, knowing my wife was starting a new life in a different city. Much depended on the choices we made in the weeks and months ahead. We could either drift apart or find our way back to one another. I flew into DFW the night before Dave's wedding and drove up the next morning. The drive was easy along Route 75, and crossing the Red River into Oklahoma meant I could add another state to my list of places visited. "Max, come over here. I want you to meet some great people." Dave was smiling widely with his new wife beside him, and I followed them into the crowd. I recognized most of the faces from previous gatherings. "So this is the captain?" a young woman asked with interest. "Max, this is Winona Gustafson." Dave introduced me to his new in-laws, and I also met a lovely woman named Susan, whom I had seen before in Charleston. Surprisingly, Dave's ex-wife Tracy was there with her new partner. It looked like they had made peace. I ended up spending most of the evening with Winona, even though I was a bit older. It didn't matter. She showed me how to two-step before the night ended, and we had a lot of fun. We parted as friends without any expectations. Winona might have wanted to know a sea captain, but I had Tammy on my mind. It didn't feel right to me. Still, it was a nice evening. The happy couple left for their honeymoon, and I headed south toward Texas Hill Country, finally arriving in San Antonio for a few days. I had visited the city years earlier and had always wanted to return. A friend helped arrange a 3-night stay for me at the Menger Hotel next to the Alamo downtown. This was the kind of trip I had hoped Tammy and I would take when I retired, traveling the country and visiting places like this. I sat at the historic bar in the Menger, listening to stories about Teddy Roosevelt and Texas Rangers, tales the bartender had probably told many times. By the end of the evening, I went upstairs, ready to do it all over again the next night. A week later, I was preparing for another port call, carrying the weight of an uncertain marriage and decisions I couldn't yet make. Almost 6 months later. The eastward journey was 14 days in when we approached the lights of the cranes along the riverside dock at Bremerhaven. With mostly calm seas, our trip was quiet except for one quick stop at sea where the engineers fixed part of the main shaft. The Molly Sen would be in port for 6 days while we waited for a shipment to arrive before we could leave. The extra days gave most of the crew a chance to take time off and explore the port city. A few of them might need a visit to the ship's doctor during the journey, but that was their business. "Captain Bunyan, would you like to join me for dinner tonight?" asked a tall, distinguished gentleman after we finished our customs check. Dennis Toller was a man with many roles, most importantly as the director of the Bremerhaven port operations. When he asks you to dinner, you don't say no. That night, we went to the Sute Deern with his daughter, a woman named Kirsten. "Max, do you take passengers when you travel?" Kirsten asked me. I had a couple of college students join me last summer for a trip from New York to Southampton. They were excited at first, but I think it got boring for them after a few days. We don't have fancy rooms or nightly entertainment unless you count the poker games among the crew. Her bright eyes showed she had an adventurous side. and I could tell she would find ways to stay entertained. I used to fly to New York often with my former husband. I remember looking down trying to find any ships, but I never could see them from so high up. I've always wanted to take that kind of journey for the adventure. I sensed she would attract attention from the crew, but she seemed capable of handling it. Well, Miss Kirsten, if you ever decide to cross the cold Atlantic, let me know. We can arrange a cozy spot for you on board, although we might need to clear some space. I chuckled at the thought. Director Toller laughed and warned that I may have invited trouble. The Molly Sen was refueled and ready as the harbor master guided us out of port. We had 6,250 containers loaded, and my engineer increased the speed as we headed into the North Sea. When we left, a winter storm was moving from the northeast U.S. coast toward Iceland, but we had the green light to go. By the time we reached the English Channel near Guernsey, the storm had shifted east, directly in our path. A weather front forming above Greenland was making it hard to predict the storm's movement. The office decided it for us. We'd stop in Portsmouth and set out again as soon as it was safe. Roger Chaffee was sitting across from me as the barmaid brought a fresh round of drinks to the table. I first met him years ago when we both worked on a Maersk ship out of Southampton. He was enjoying being single after his first wife left him. I'll never forget the look on his face when I turned down his invitation to join him and some college students for their summer adventure. I showed him my ring, and he just smiled. Are you sure? I was sure. Memories of Tammy kept any excitement at bay. Roger left to join the students, and I didn't see him again until the next afternoon, looking very pleased. So is she really gone? He asked. I had told him about my trip back and what I discovered about Tammy's last months in Vancouver. I might have left out the hurt, but anyone could see it on my face. I really don't know, Roger. I usually talk to her weekly for a few minutes, and we agreed that was best. Since I haven't seen her since she left, I really can't say. Do you want her back? That was the big question. If we were at home, I would say yes right away. I really wanted that, but it was complicated. That's a tough question. You might need to ask me again after she hopefully returns. We stayed longer, enjoying the drinks and the small crowd. Some middle-aged women chatted with us, but both of our pasts made starting something new seem unlikely. Roger was seeing someone seriously, planning to marry her. She was a sturdy woman from the north of England, and he seemed sure she was the one for him. As for me, I relied on my imagination, aware of temptations that had always been there. But I resisted as long as I thought there was hope for reconciliation. The next morning, heavy rain hit the bridge as I took over the watch from my second officer. The storm had pushed further east, and the winds were picking up in the channel. By mid-morning, the longshoremen stopped their work, and activity at the dock slowed down. "We're bringing on a passenger, sir," my steward informed me after the crew finished securing the ship. "She'll board as soon as the storm calms, and we're ready to leave." That was surprising news. I was sure the ship's kitchen wasn't ready for a paying passenger, and we'd need to prepare an extra room. "You said she? Where did she come from?" I asked, recalling my dinner chats from previous nights. "Exeter, sir. The steward prepared for our new passenger." I returned to my tasks as the storm continued for a few hours. By early evening, we were set to depart, hoping to leave by morning. "Our passenger, Miss Seaver, has boarded, sir, and the first mate showed her to her room. Should I set up a captain's table for 9 p.m.? When we have a passenger, we usually meet them after boarding to go over some rules and safety guidelines. Being on a ship can be risky, and the safety of everyone on board is very important." "Yes, please. Set it up outside my stateroom and have the first and second officers join us." I changed into my formal clothes and made sure my captain's hat was on straight before entering the board. "Captain Max, what a wonderful sight you are," she said with an enthusiastic smile. "Miss Seaver?" I asked, surprised. "My ex-husband's name. Toller Seaver, actually. I never changed it back after our divorce." Kirsten Toller Seaver had clearly made an impression on my two officers, who struggled to hide their smiles. They had gone through the safety briefing and explained the areas she could visit on the ship. Next was my turn to welcome her as the captain. "So, Kirsten, how did you end up on this trip? We're quite far from Bremerhaven." "Oh, it's quite a tale, Max. I told my dad I wanted to take a voyage, but by the time I was ready, you had already left." Then I heard about the storm, and he said you had to stop here. The only airport I could reach was in Exeter, so here I am. I called him when I was already on my way, so there was no turning back. At first, your office wasn't sure about letting me come, but I told them I could arrive 12 hours before departure, and they agreed after I mentioned my dad. I cleared my throat softly and glanced at my officers, who were clearly entertained by Miss Kirsten's friendliness. It must have been quite a journey, ma'am, especially with the storm. I hope your accommodations are satisfactory. If I had known you were coming, I would have— Oh, no, Max, it's perfectly fine as is. I wouldn't want it any other way. I couldn't argue with her joyful smile, so we chatted a little longer before letting her return to her quarters. Captain, the crew will surely be happy, my first officer said with a big grin. I'm sure they will be, I thought as I went up to the bridge. Later, Roger Chaffee guided us out of port, and he gave a playful wink when he saw Miss Kirsten on the observation deck. The presence of a woman always seemed to catch his attention. Next time, old friend, he joked before heading off to the skiff on the side. The Molly Seine had 9 crew members, all from Portugal. They had been on board for several trips, with some new faces coming in as others left for different jobs. Though there are many stories about sailors from faraway places, most of our crew shared the same background, which made it easier for everyone to work together. A few experienced Portuguese sailors led the crew when needed, though that was rare. Most of their energy was spent on shore. Working 12 hours on and 12 off for 10 weeks didn't leave much time for trouble. Still, with Miss Kirsten on board, I made sure all my staff were attentive. Max, it's so beautiful out here. Is it always like this? Miss Kirsten asked me a few evenings into the journey as she stood on the observation deck. The only light for miles is from the stars unless the deck lights are on. That night, a crescent moon hung in the sky, and 1,000,000 twinkling stars created a stunning backdrop. As I spoke, I felt her hand gently press against my back. I excused myself when the bridge radioed for an urgent matter. Later that evening, my mind wandered during my free time. My crew ate their meals in the wardroom, which seats 6. Since 2 places were occupied, we usually had 4 at a time. With our guest, Kirsten sat next to me, making her the center of attention. No one seemed to mind. My second officer seemed especially taken by her from the moment he saw her, leading my first officer to tease him by calling him second puppy when he thought I couldn't hear. It was all in good fun, so I said nothing. A few nights later, as the stars shone brightly once more, Miss Kirsten and I enjoyed each other's company on the observation deck, talking about our lives. Max, you and your ex-wife never had children? She asked, gazing at the dark sea. No, we chose lives of adventure, mine out here and hers in academia. Also, she wasn't able to, and we thought adoption wouldn't be fair given my absences and her career goals. How about you? Do you have any kids, Kirsten? She thought for a moment and then took my arm. Oh, yes, I have a daughter. She's all grown up now, or at least she thinks she is. She's 20 and away at university in Würzburg. She's very independent and studying physics and a lot of things that I just don't understand. Her name is Marlene, after her great-grandmother, my father's mom. For a moment she smiled as she thought about her child. Max, do you mind? She said, pulling out a small flask from her jacket. Not at all, I replied. Passengers were allowed to keep personal items as long as they didn't have too much. I kept a small bottle of cognac in my stateroom for special occasions, even though it wasn't officially allowed. She took a sip and offered it to me, but I declined. Duty and all, I thought. After our evening chat, I returned to the bridge for some reports before heading to bed. I got back to my stateroom around 11 p.m. and, after doing some reading, fell asleep with my alarm set for 5 a.m. People say that as you get older, you have a harder time sleeping through the night. That's never been a problem for me. Once I hit the pillow, I usually sleep soundly for 5 to 6 hours unless the alarm goes off. However, it went off at 2:34 a.m. with a loud noise that jolted me awake. It wasn't my alarm clock. I heard a man's voice filled with pain. By the time I jumped out of bed and grabbed my coat, the officer on duty rushed past my room and down the hallway. Outside, there was a lot of noise, and the door to Kirsten's room was open. When I got there, a man was lying on the floor, and the officer was trying to help him. What is happening here? I shouted above the noise. The injured man was bleeding, and Kirsten stood nearby, looking frightened. I quickly grabbed a robe from the door and handed it to her. I woke up to find him in my room and panicked. "I just grabbed my needlework bag from the table," she said, clearly shaken. I put an arm around her and guided her to my stateroom. "Kirsten, please make yourself comfortable here while I find out what happened." I handed her a box of tissues and pointed to the fridge if she wanted a drink. When I returned, my staff and the 2 Portuguese chiefs were there. It became clear that the man had entered Kirsten's room without permission. Our investigation showed he had used a tool to break the lock. Crew members were never allowed above the 3rd deck of the bridge unless called for official reasons. The doctor checked Kirsten for any injuries and said she was fine. By the time breakfast was served, none of us had managed to catch any more sleep. I asked my engineer to install locks on the stateroom doors until we could fix the locking system. "What will happen to that man from the other night?" she asked me when we spoke on the observation deck a few nights later. That was a good question. The Molly Seine was under Panamanian maritime law while in international waters. The man would be sent back to his country once we docked. Kirsten would have to give a statement along with my staff and myself once we reached land, which would then be sent to the Panamanian consulate in Tampa. "What I really want to do is throw him overboard," I joked to lighten the mood. "I'm guessing he'll be deported. He'll lose his chance to dock anywhere in the U.S. and Europe. More importantly, how are you holding up?" She squeezed my arm and smiled softly. "I'm okay now, but the first couple of nights were hard, especially after the shock wore off. My dad taught my sister and me how to take care of ourselves when we were young, and this wasn't my first scary experience. I had to defend myself once at university, but this was a bit different. Seriously, I'm managing well. What about the man's injuries?" That was another matter. The doctor did his best to treat the man's wounds, but he had been hurt badly. Once the bleeding stopped and he was bandaged, he could get proper care once we reached port, but that was still 4 days away. Until then, he got fresh bandages and some time outside each day. No one on board seemed to feel sorry for him, not even his fellow crew members. The next few days were quiet, but I spent a lot of my free time with Kirsten. By the time we reached the shipping channel near Charleston Harbor, I felt she knew almost everything about me except a few personal details. Some things just don't come up in conversation. We sailed past the harbor, and the harbor master met us with 2 tugboats to take us to the Wando Welch terminal across the river. 2 short blasts and 1 long blast as we passed East Bay let my contact know I was ready to disembark. I hadn't called Tammy yet, so I had no idea if she heard it. After clearing customs and completing the statements about the incident, the Department of Homeland Security boarded the ship and took the crewmen into custody. I handed over the controls to my engineer before stepping off the ship. "Captain, let me take you and Kirsten downtown," my first officer said. He had already loaded Kirsten's bags onto a dolly and was heading to his wife's truck. Kirsten was staying at the Spectator Hotel on State Street, just south of Market Square, for a few days before traveling to Washington, D.C., and then on to New York City. From there, she planned to fly home. When we dropped her off, a bellhop took care of her bags, and she smiled and gave me a hug to say thanks. "Max, remember, when you're done with your work, you promise to show me around the Holy City," she said. With that, I went home. No white roses this time. Everything looked pretty much the same as it did 10 weeks ago. I lifted the latch on the iron gate, reminding myself that I still needed to fix it, and walked down the courtyard to the back door. The house was quiet, just as I left it weeks ago. There were a few signs of the guests who moved in before I left, but otherwise nothing had changed. When Tammy left for Vancouver, I decided to rent another room to a family friend of the girl already staying with us. Both of them were quiet and kept the place neat, often making it hard to tell if they were home at all. One of the girls had left a couple of messages near the phone. As I looked through them and the pile of mostly junk mail, I noticed that Tammy had forwarded a few business letters. Among them was a note from Mrs. Sophie Pryor. "Mr. Bunyan, please call me when you're back in town, Miss Pryor." It was short and had her number. I set it aside for a moment and dropped off some laundry in the utility room before heading upstairs for a shower and a change of clothes. I planned to grab a quick bite to eat at Henry's and maybe enjoy a drink or two. "I heard you come in earlier, Max," Satch called out as he slid a cold drink in front of me. "Last time we talked, you were thinking about moving to a retirement home." I had turned 52 a few months ago, and Satch loved to remind me of it. It didn't matter that he was just a year younger. Honestly, it was just another year for me. I felt healthy and active, with only a bit of gray at my temples and all my teeth still intact. "I'm thinking of opening a place for college students, 3 to a room," I said. Given that I already had 2 students living in the house, Satch just shook his head and laughed at the idea. One of the college students at a nearby table overheard and came over to ask if I was serious. She was looking for a spot to stay for the summer session in a few months. I handed her my business card with the numbers of the 2 residents already living with me and told her to reach out. We both burst out laughing. Not bad for an older guy thinking about retirement. A couple of days later, I remembered Sophie Pryor's note and decided to call her. "Max, thanks for calling back. I know you're busy and I wasn't sure if you'd want to chat," Sophie said on the second ring. "Sophie, I always make time for you. Is this about your husband and my wife?" I asked directly. "Yes, it is. Thomas has been trouble for years. I didn't think Tammy would get involved with him. I tried to call you earlier, but you were away each time I was back on the battery. This time, I left a note with that nice girl staying with you." "Yes, they are both good girls. Well, now I've cut Thomas off and told him to leave my home in Charleston. He even left with a black eye. He was at our condo on King Street, but it seems he is in Vancouver a lot lately too, according to his secretary. I thought you should know, since Tammy has been in Vancouver for 6 months. I can't imagine what she saw in him. Actually, she called me about a month ago and asked if I knew how to get Thomas to leave her alone. She was very sorry about everything. It seems she's tired of his constant attention and he wouldn't stop trying to see her. I think he even tried to stay with her, but she wouldn't allow it. I know this doesn't excuse her previous fling with Jim Dahlberg, but at least she's getting over Thomas. I've handled that on my end." As soon as she said that, I felt uneasy. I kicked myself for not noticing sooner. Jim Dahlberg, a visiting professor from Kingston University, had been at our house a few times before. The idea of Tammy and Jim being together made more sense to me than her being with Thomas. There was a long pause, and I sensed that Sophie was concerned. "Max, were you not aware of Jim?" she asked. "No, Sophie, I'm hearing this for the first time." "Oh dear, I thought everyone knew since Tammy's been in Vancouver. Do you know how long it's been happening?" "I'm not sure. I've heard rumors since last year. All I know is it was still happening when she called me, and she's evidently living in the same place as he is." "Sophie, thank you for telling me this. It's important for me to know with everything else going on." I promised to keep in touch and ended the call. "Sophie, you really know how to talk," I whispered to myself. Along with the news about Tammy and Dahlberg, I learned that Thomas Pryor didn't really own anything they enjoyed together. He had no claim to Sophie's wealth or properties, since she had inherited most of it before they were married. They lived on Battery Row, the best address in the city. She also owned a condo on King Street and mentioned that she planned to move his things and change the locks while he was away. 6 months apart now felt confirmed, and while I should have been upset, I felt surprisingly calm. Yes, I was angry about the lies, but it made sense. Jim Dahlberg seemed much better for any serious relationship. Thomas was a mystery to me. I still didn't understand the whole story. There had to be more to it. I glanced at the ring on my finger, hesitated, and then took it off, placing it in the candy dish on the mantel. "Well, hello, my adventurous friend," she said when I answered the phone. I hadn't thought about Kirsten since my friend and I dropped her off at the Spectator. Just hearing her voice brought back memories of that evening. "Good day to you too, Miss Kirsten." "Max, how is your situation now that you're back?" "Pretty much the same. I'm on my own again," I replied, keeping the details to myself. After a moment, she said, "I need a dinner companion tonight. I hope you can join me. I made a reservation for 2 at the Oak. It comes highly recommended. Afterward, we could take a walk since it's such a lovely evening. It's nicer than the snowy weather back in Bremerhaven." She had definitely piqued my interest. "You can pick me up in the lobby downstairs at 7 p.m. I wasn't sure if I had agreed, but when we ended the call, I found myself getting ready, searching for my favorite dinner jacket and taking a shower. As I prepared for the night, my thoughts wandered, excited about dinner and a walk. At 6:55, I waited at the bar of the Spectator for Miss Toller Seaver. When I looked up, she stood there, stunning in her midnight blue dress. "Miss Kirsten, you look beautiful as always. Captain Bunyan, you have a way with words. What person wouldn't love being called beautiful?" After finishing my drink, Kirsten wore a wrap over her shoulders, and we caught a pedicab to Broad Street and the Oak. The maitre d' led us to our cozy table on the second floor. "And the missus?" she asked over dessert. I hadn't shared my discoveries from a couple of days ago, but we were comfortable enough for me to say this was likely the end of her current living situation. "No hope of getting back together?" she asked seriously. "I don't see how that could happen." A spark seemed to light up her eyes. "That's why you're not wearing your ring?" I had forgotten about it, but she was right. Tammy and I were over. "Let me pay, and we can go for a walk," I suggested. We stepped out onto Broad Street, and Kirsten took off her heels, sliding on some comfy shoes before taking my arm. We wandered through antique shops and galleries. It was a cool, early March evening, just right for her wrap and my jacket. After an hour or so, I got another pedicab, and we headed to Henry's house for another drink. I wanted to impress Satch with Kirsten by my side. "You know my usual, man, and a white wine for my friend," I joked with him at the bar. It was a weeknight, and the crowd was smaller than on weekends. "It's nice to see Max has found a companion," he smiled, mouthing Tammy to me. I shook my head slightly. Kirsten smiled and held my arm tighter, which amused Satch even more. We might have had one too many drinks, and the atmosphere grew relaxed as we exchanged knowing smiles. I glanced at my bare finger but pushed any worries aside. "My place?" I asked. "Yes, let's go," she replied. The house was quiet as I turned the deadbolt and we entered. The two students lived on the third floor, and I rarely saw them in the evenings, which was probably for the best since my mind was elsewhere. "Max," she whispered. She looked toward the stairs, then returned her gaze to mine with a playful smile. I followed her upstairs, enchanted by her presence. "Straight ahead," I said when she reached the landing. We entered my room, and I felt a rush of excitement that had been missing for a while. "Let's enjoy tonight," I said, eager to make the most of our time together. "Absolutely," she replied with a bright smile. The evening was filled with laughter and conversation as old worries faded away, allowing room for the joy of the moment and the possibilities of what was next. She looked into my eyes, and I could feel a special connection between us. I sensed her interest, but I was determined to keep it respectful and not rush into anything I might regret. I gently held her hand as she looked at me, but before we could go further, I paused. She leaned back, quietly inviting me, but I knew I had to take charge. I wasn't going to let things go too far, so I pulled away to keep the moment respectful. We talked closely, feeling warmth between us, but I knew it was important to remain respectful. Eventually, we settled into a comfortable hug, enjoying the closeness without crossing any lines. The next morning, I woke up to find Kirsten already awake. I didn't hear her while I took a shower, and when I came back to the room, she was still gone. I put on some comfortable clothes and went downstairs to the kitchen. "Good morning, Captain Max." Kirsten greeted me with a bright smile as she sat with my two students from upstairs. They had playful looks as they buttered their muffins. "The girls and I were just having a nice chat after they helped me pick up my things this morning." She nodded toward her clothes in an empty chair. "That was nice of them," I replied, hiding a smile as I poured myself some coffee. The two girls giggled as they left, and Kirsten gave me a knowing look. "Well, I forgot to tell you that I rent out the top floor of the house." She made a face that showed she saw I made a small mistake. "That's okay. They seem nice. I think one of them might like you a little too much, Max. Just be careful not to hurt her feelings." She smiled. We enjoyed breakfast together, and after tidying up, I showed her around the market area. By lunchtime, we found a cozy cafe to sit at. "Max, have you thought about what you will do about your wife? I know you said it's over, but does she know?" It was a fair question, one that stuck in my mind. There was Tammy, of course, and the complicated situation involving Thomas, Sophie, and others. "She didn't tell me the truth when she had the chance. Now, I don't see a way back. It's not just what we did here, Kirsten. It's about what she's done and keeps doing." "So, she didn't end it?" "Looks like not." I stared out at the busy street, watching people walk by. I realized that if Tammy had told me the truth that rainy day in the kitchen, I might have forgiven her. But now, that was all in the past. I knew what I had to do. Kirsten was leaving for D.C. the next day and then heading to New York City for a couple of weeks. The chemistry between us was obvious, and I briefly thought about dropping everything to join her. but I knew I had other matters to resolve. We finished our day with a water taxi tour of the harbor, and I walked her back to her hotel. "Are you sure you won't come up, Max?" We had talked about what I needed to do, so I turned down the offer, though we shared a long hug and spoke softly to each other. I then walked back toward the market. It was cloudy and drizzly when I arrived. I grabbed my bag, took the hotel shuttle, and after settling in, I found myself at the bar. I stirred my drink while watching local news on the TV. A friendly waitress offered me a refill, but I had things to do, so I kindly said no. "West 10th, next to the university, please," I told the driver when he picked me up. I had checked the address and knew she would be there, or at least her phone was. The envelope in my lap felt heavy as we navigated through the busy streets. We stopped in front of a 4-story apartment building, and I looked up at the top floor. I wondered if fate had set enough barriers in my way. For a brief moment, I thought about dropping the envelope in a mailbox nearby and walking away. "Do you want me to wait, sir?" the driver asked, sensing my uncertainty. "No, I'm fine. I'm not sure how long I'll be." He handed me his card after I paid, just in case I needed a ride back. I climbed the stairs to the top floor and stood before the neat entryway, flanked by potted plants by the door. The number 404A was written in fancy lettering on the frame. I still had my gloves on when I knocked at the door and then again. "Who is it?" a man shouted as I heard him come closer. He opened the door and looked shocked to see me. "Max, I didn't expect... I had worked hard all my life, and at 52 I wasn't soft." Without thinking, I gave Jim a solid punch and he fell to the floor. I stepped over him and took a seat in the living room just as Tammy rushed down the hallway, droplets from her shower still on her. She wore a short robe that didn't cover much, but I was far too upset to notice. She stood in the hallway staring at me, unable to say anything. I nodded toward her partner on the floor. "Take a seat, Tammy. We have some things to talk about," I said as I stood to close the front door, stepping around the man who had betrayed me. "Why didn't you just tell the truth before, Tammy? I guess it's clear you never intended to end things with him." Jim started to stir, and Tammy hurried to help him. "Max, this wasn't needed. What were you thinking?" I stared at her, confused. "I was thinking about all the times he lied to me when I wasn't around. That's what I was thinking." I threw a yellow envelope onto the coffee table and saw her eyes widen in surprise. "Max, it's not what you think." I didn't want to hear it. I walked down the hall to the bedroom, where I saw the messy bed and clothes scattered on the floor. Tammy had helped Dahlberg sit on the couch, where he looked dazed. "I've been fair, Tammy. Half of our savings from the last 12 years since we got married. We've both got our own retirement plans, so let's keep that simple. I owned my house before you came, and you have your own place in West Ashley. Let's make this easy. Just sign the papers, and I'll have your things delivered." She looked heartbroken, and Dahlberg sat nearby holding his jaw. "Max, let me come home and talk about this. Maybe we can work through it." I shook my head. "Tammy, I almost fell in love with you the first time I saw you, and if I'm honest, I still have feelings for you. But you broke my trust. I can't trust you again. How can I? It feels like it could have been 30 men instead of just 3. I'll never know, so why does it matter? You ended this and I can't see a way back." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, final and irrevocable. Tammy's eyes widened in shock, her mouth opening as if to protest, but no sound came out. She seemed to be grappling with the weight of what I had just said, trying to find a foothold in the crumbling ground beneath her. But there was no saving this, no salvaging what we had once shared. The time for reconciliation had passed, and all that remained now was the cold, hard truth. For a moment, I thought she might try to deny it all, to spin some last, desperate lie to pull me back in. But instead, her shoulders slumped, and she let out a shuddering breath, as if the fight had finally drained out of her. "Max, please," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I never wanted it to end like this. I never wanted to hurt you." I stared at her, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching this scene unfold from a distance. The woman standing before me, the woman I had once loved more than anything in this world, now seemed like a stranger. I had seen her vulnerability, her tears, but they no longer moved me. They felt like the last act in a tragic play, one that I had seen through long before the curtain fell. "It doesn't matter what you wanted, Tammy," I said quietly. "What matters is what you did." She flinched as if I had struck her, her eyes pleading with me for understanding, for forgiveness, but there was none left to give. She had used up every ounce of goodwill, every shred of trust, and all that remained was a hollow shell of the man I had once been. I was lost, Max," she stammered, her words coming out in a rush. "I didn't know what I was doing. I was lonely, and Jim, he was there. He listened to me. He made me feel, don't." I cut her off, my voice sharp and cold. "Don't try to justify it. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." Her face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized the full extent of what she had lost. But before she could say anything else, the door behind her creaked open, and Jim Dahlberg stepped into the room. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his eyes bloodshot and weary, his posture tense as he took in the scene before him. "Tammy, is everything—" he began, but his words faltered when he saw me standing there, the cold fury in my eyes unmistakable. For a moment, the three of us were locked in a tense, unbearable silence, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. I could see the fear in Jim's eyes, the dawning realization that this confrontation had been inevitable from the start. "Max," he started again, his voice trembling slightly. "Look, I know this is complicated, but—" "Complicated?" I repeated, my voice dripping with contempt. "You think this is complicated, Jim? You think sneaking around with another man's wife, lying to your so-called friend, is complicated?" He swallowed hard, his gaze shifting nervously between me and Tammy. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. It just happened." I took a step forward, my fists clenching at my sides as the anger I had been holding back for so long finally bubbled to the surface. "You're a coward, Jim, a pathetic, spineless coward who couldn't even face me like a man. You hid behind lies and deception, and now you want to stand here and tell me it just happened?" He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. The rage that had been simmering beneath the surface for months now boiled over, and before I knew it, I had crossed the room in 2 quick strides and slammed my fist into his jaw. The impact sent him sprawling to the floor, a look of shock and pain etched across his face. "Max, stop!" Tammy cried, rushing forward to place herself between us. "Please, don't do this!" But I wasn't listening. The adrenaline was pumping through my veins, the red haze of fury clouding my vision as I glared down at the man who had betrayed me. He had taken everything from me, my wife, my trust, my peace of mind, and now he was going to pay for it. "You think I'm just going to walk away, Jim?" I spat, my voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "You think you can ruin my life and get away with it?" Jim struggled to sit up, wiping the blood from his split lip as he looked up at me with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I never wanted to hurt you, Max. But Tammy, she wasn't happy. She wanted something more, and I—" "Shut up!" I roared, grabbing him by the collar and hauling him to his feet. "You don't get to justify this. You don't get to stand there and pretend you're the victim." Tammy was crying now, her hands clutching at my arm as she tried to pull me away from Jim. "Max, please don't do this. We can talk about this. We can work something out." But her words fell on deaf ears. I was beyond reason, beyond rational thought. All I could see was the man who had destroyed my marriage, the man who had taken what was mine, and I wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. With a grunt of effort, I shoved him against the wall, my grip tightening on his collar as I leaned in close, my voice low and dangerous. "You think you can take what's mine, Jim? You think you can just walk into my life and take everything from me?" His eyes widened in terror, and for a brief moment I saw the realization dawn in his eyes. He knew I could end him right then and there, that I had nothing left to lose. But before I could act on the impulse, I felt a hand on my shoulder, pulling me back. "Max, stop!" Tammy pleaded, her voice trembling. "Please, just stop!" I hesitated, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I looked down at her. Her face was a mess of tears and desperation, and for a moment I felt the anger waver, replaced by a crushing sense of sorrow. What was I doing? What had I become? With a shuddering breath, I released my grip on Jim and stepped back, my hands trembling as the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't who I was. I wasn't a man driven by rage, a man who solved his problems with violence. But here I was, standing in the ruins of my marriage, my life in tatters, and I had let the darkness consume me. Jim slid down the wall, breathing heavily, his eyes still filled with fear. Tammy stood between us, her hands outstretched, as if trying to protect both of us from each other. The sight of her, broken and desperate, cut through the fog of anger, leaving only the cold, hard truth behind. "It's over, Tammy," I said quietly, my voice hollow. "There's nothing left to say." She opened her mouth to protest, but I shook my head, cutting her off. "You made your choice, and now you have to live with it. I'm done. We're done." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the apartment, the weight of the past few months pressing down on me with every step. I didn't look back. I couldn't. There was nothing for me there anymore, nothing but pain and betrayal. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, the reality of what I had just done began to sink in. I had ended it. I had finally severed the ties that had bound me to Tammy, to the life we had built together, and now all that was left was the emptiness, the hollow ache of loss. But even as the grief threatened to overwhelm me, I knew I had made the right choice. There was no going back. The past was a shattered mirror, and no amount of effort could piece it back together. All I could do now was move forward, to rebuild my life from the ashes of what had been. And as I walked away from the apartment, the faint sounds of Tammy's sobs echoing in my ears, I made a silent vow. I would never let anyone take from me what was rightfully mine again. "You can't mean this, Max, you can't." I looked at her, standing in that apartment, away from home, and then nodded at Jim Dahlberg before shaking my head. "Don't come back to the house, Tammy. There won't be anything there for you. Everyone will know you're not welcome. Just sign the papers and continue living your life as you have while I've been gone." I turned away before she could see my tears and walked out. When I got to the stairs, I looked back and saw her standing in the doorway, crying. I hurried away, hoping to leave before anyone questioned what had happened. The next day was a quiet flight back to Charleston. The police never showed at the hotel, and I left Vancouver feeling uneasy and uncertain about the future. No matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I still cared about Tammy. I knew deep down that my 20-year marriage was over. I sat with a pint of beer as I went over the paperwork in front of me. I was just 3 months away from a 30-year career, and if I kept going out, it would be for money and not for growth. The benefits wouldn't get any better, and if I was sensible, I would retire and live calmly. But I loved the sea too much to do that. I decided to work for another year. "Max, I'm sorry to hear about you and Tammy. You two had a long relationship," Satch said sincerely. He had gone through marriage 3 times and none had worked out. "Yeah, I'll be okay. We'll both get through this and find our way." Inside, I knew that wasn't true. When I returned from Vancouver, I sadly packed up Tammy's things and had them sent to her sister's house like I promised. They say sea captains don't cry, but I struggled as I cleared out her drawers. I felt broken inside. People who think anger and revenge help heal a broken heart have never truly loved. They talk a big game, but they don't understand the pain of what's lost. I stood in the empty room, tears streaming down my face. Later, I went to Henry's and had a drink, seeking a brief escape from my sadness, preparing for the weeks ahead before I had to leave again. The Molly Sane was under power again, 3 days out of Charleston. I lay back in my bunk, catching up on messages. Kirsten was sending me occasional emails checking in on me. We had talked at length about the confrontation one evening when she was in New York. Moving from one relationship to another is tough, almost impossible. Still, Kirsten and I had a connection that was hard to describe. She understood my heart was still tied to someone else, and whether she meant to or not, she gave me room. This made me like her even more. As the weeks went by, I hadn't heard from Tammy about signing the papers. After a short job in Rotterdam, we docked in Bremerhaven for a few days. Once everything was settled, I gave the crew a break and headed ashore with a personal mission. A taxi dropped me off in front of a tall townhouse. As I stepped out, I saw a face peek through the curtains. I rang the bell and the door opened right away. "Max, I've been waiting," she said softly, stepping forward. I was speechless, feeling warmly welcomed. "Come in, please," she invited. We walked into her living room, and she took me to the kitchen, pouring us some drinks to celebrate my arrival. As we relaxed, I took in her home, cozy, filled with antique furniture and family photos, including one of her lovely daughter and another with her late mother. My dad lives with me on the top floor. He's been there since Mom passed away 4 years ago. She smiled at the memories. My sister Lydia stays on the second floor when she visits, but she's been here less since she found someone special. We enjoyed each other's company, and as the evening carried on, I felt captivated by her presence, reminded of what a true connection feels like. Despite everything I've been through, I understood that relationships were complicated. Max, when my ex-husband left, it took nearly 2 years for me to finalize the divorce. He was patient, even after he had moved on. To get back at him, I tried to find comfort in other places, hoping he would think twice about his choice. He never did, and it was Lydia who pushed me to finally sign the papers. Then, just when I was ready to move forward, he wanted to come back. He was wrong, I said firmly. Yes, and your wife is making a mistake by letting you go. Her situation was different from mine, but we both understood how relationships can fall apart. It's often easier to see things clearly after the fact, and I promised myself I wouldn't rush into another relationship. As we chatted, her eyes sparkled playfully. "Why don't we eat in?" she suggested with a grin. We spent the evening together, appreciating each other's company and the cozy atmosphere. Sharing a meal felt special, and the bond we were forming was real. She moved closer to me, and I felt a strong sense of connection as we talked. I laughed as I noticed the playful look in her eyes. I knew it would take time for me to heal, but the chemistry between us was clear. Kirsten was everything I admired, confident and charming. I couldn't ignore how drawn I was to her. "I really want to be near you," I whispered, and she smiled, welcoming my closeness. We found ourselves in a warm moment that felt more than just friendship. Her look changed from dreamy to intrigued as we talked and connected in that soft glow. The fan above us slowly turned, and we enjoyed the peaceful silence. "Max, where did you say you studied engineering? Castine, right? In New England?" "Yes, at Maine Maritime Academy in Castine, Maine, a lovely little spot on the coast. I'd love to show you on a map one day." "I want to do more than that. I'd love to visit Maine. Papa says it's a lot like Norway, but with a rougher coast. It sounds amazing. Maybe you could take me there someday?" I nodded, smiling both inside and out. I could think of no better place to escape than a cottage in down East Maine with her. In my younger days, I often dreamed of moving back to Castine or even going to Vinalhaven. It felt romantic, even if impractical, so it lingered in my thoughts over the years. I have many fond memories from there. It's beautiful in summer, though winter can be tough. Maybe we can take a trip during one of my breaks. I saw that sparkle in her eyes again. In the morning, Kirsten prepared a traditional German breakfast for me, which I enjoyed. It included an open-face egg dish with ham on pumpernickel, along with black coffee and a pastry. "Is Dennis not here?" I asked, noticing he was missing. "Oh no, he's in Hamburg for a conference." I felt a sense of relief knowing he wasn't around while we shared this moment. She smiled as if she could read my thoughts. "Where are you heading next?" she asked. "I have to wait in line to go through the Suez Canal." "Papa says most captains dislike that." "He's right. We might have to sit in Port Said for a while if the timing is off. The good news is I'll finish my rotation in 5 weeks and have 6 weeks off just as summer starts." I could sense her excitement, but I needed to wrap things up and head back to work. We said our goodbyes, and she kindly drove me to the riverside where I was to meet my watch officer. I watched 4 men board the Molly Seine from the starboard side, each carrying black duffel bags and wearing gray caps. They mostly kept to themselves, assessing the deck. They were private security personnel hired because of the risks near the Indian Ocean, where piracy is a real threat. We were transporting goods to Athens, South Africa, and Argentina. Otherwise, I wouldn't have taken the route near the Horn of Africa. "Captain, Port Said has cleared us for entry into the canal once we get past Zakros," my first officer announced. That was good news. It meant other ships were behind us, and we could enter the canal without delay. As we passed through Port Said, the security team became more alert and took up their positions as we traveled south. We had to remain cautious, not only because of pirates but due to other threats in the area, although the Egyptian army was strong there. We moved into the Red Sea without any issues and continued down toward the coast of Somalia when the watch on the bridge alerted our security team. Off to the left, a small fishing boat was launching a couple of smaller boats, each with 5 or 6 people on board. "Captain, we're being targeted," my second officer shouted. We heard the sound of impacts hitting the ship, and some of the security team began to respond. The crew had already left the deck and was out of danger. Only I, the 5 officers, and the riggers remained above deck. Then all at once, chaos erupted when a rocket zoomed past the bridge, narrowly missing a stack of containers just below us. "Everyone move back behind the wall," I shouted, urging them to take cover behind a protective barrier we had built for situations like this. It wasn't a perfect shelter, but it would help keep us safe. The riggers were returning fire at the trawler with heavy machine guns, shooting powerful rounds. Just after the rocket flew by, one of the riggers took aim with a weapon and fired back, right before another rocket hit the left side of our ship. It shook us, but thankfully it wasn't a serious blow. The trawler facing us wasn't so lucky. It took a direct hit on one of its fuel tanks and exploded in a big fireball. In that moment, the riggers turned their attention to the boats trying to escape, and soon both boats were covered in thick smoke and flames. We saw people jumping into the water, likely hoping we'd save them from what awaited them at sea. Our ship, the Molly Sane, was moving at full speed, and there was no way I was going to slow down to help those who had just attacked us. We were in international waters, and while I reported to the Home Office, I was in charge. We didn't have to stop for anyone until we got to Cape Town, other than to let the nearby authorities know what happened. As long as our ship stayed seaworthy, we were continuing on. "Captain, there's a man with a light injury to his arm. He's being treated now. 2 of my crew members gathered the spent shell casings and, with your approval, we can regroup and prepare for the rest of this trip. We're not out of danger yet." He was a young man, maybe in his early 30s, and reminded me of a former instructor I had. He was right. We still had a long way to go. It was then that the adrenaline started to fade, and I needed to take a break. Anticipating danger was one thing, facing it was entirely different. That's when I decided enough was enough. 2 intense situations in a row, the one with Kirsten and now this pirate attack. I figured I'd better inform the Home Office about my plans to rethink taking on more missions. Until then, I gathered my first and second officers, put out 3 glasses, and poured some cognac for all of us. "Here's to the rough seas and another hard-earned dollar, gentlemen." We toasted, took a drink, and did it again before I made a satellite call to the Home Office. 3 weeks later, we were crossing the English Channel on our way to Bremerhaven. The PMSC riggers had left us at Cape Town and headed off to a new job in Indonesia. We had only minor damage, a dent on the back rail and 2 damaged containers. Overall, we were quite lucky. My Portuguese crew did not agree, though. One of the chiefs thought half the crew would quit once we reached land. "They are not soldiers," he remarked. True enough, I thought as I opened an email my attorney had sent me days ago. The plane landed at Charleston International, the second part of my journey from Frankfurt to Dulles, and I took an Uber to the peninsula. My old neighbor, Mr. Shields, had planted a fresh row of roses by his front windows, and they were blooming beautifully. "Your girls have been a great help, Mr. Bunyan. Nice girls, both of them," he said as I dropped off pastries from Kaminsky's that he enjoyed. "2 of the best," I smiled as I walked towards the iron gate. The craftsman had repaired the latch, and everything looked good again as I tidied up some old blooms on the path to the back door. With a fresh cup of coffee, I started going through the email and letter from my attorney. Tammy still hadn't signed the papers, insisting on a second chance and wanting to talk at the house. She had returned to Charleston a few weeks earlier after being gone for months. Frustration bubbled up as I read her messages for what felt like the 100th time, and I decided against any meeting at home. I couldn't imagine any scenario that would fix things between us. Still, I called my attorney and set up a meeting in a neutral place. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement as I pulled up to the small cafe where Sophie Pryor had suggested we meet. It was a quiet spot, tucked away from the bustling streets of downtown Charleston, the kind of place where secrets could be exchanged without fear of prying eyes. As I stepped out of the car, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Sophie had always been something of an enigma to me, aloof, poised, and fiercely protective of her privacy. The fact that she had reached out to me, especially after everything that had happened, made me wonder what she had up her sleeve. I spotted her immediately as I entered the cafe. She was seated at a corner table, her back to the wall, a position that allowed her to survey the entire room. Sophie was the kind of woman who never let her guard down, not even for a moment. As I approached, she looked up from her cup of tea, her expression unreadable. "Max," she greeted me with a slight nod as I took the seat opposite her. "I'm glad you could make it." "Sophie," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I wasn't sure what to expect when you called." She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I imagine you have a lot of questions." "More than a few," I admitted, leaning back in my chair, "starting with why you wanted to meet in the first place." Sophie took a sip of her tea, her gaze never leaving mine. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since everything came to light. About Thomas, about Tammy, about the lies we've both been living with. It's become clear to me that neither of us deserved what happened." I raised an eyebrow, not quite sure where she was going with this. "What are you saying, Sophie?" She set her cup down gently, her fingers tracing the rim as if deep in thought. "I'm saying that I know more than you think. About Thomas, about Tammy, about their little escapades." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I kept my expression neutral, but inside, my mind was racing. Sophie Pryor was a woman who didn't speak lightly, and if she claimed to know something, I had no doubt it was true. "I had my suspicions about Thomas for years," she continued, her voice steady, "but it wasn't until recently that I had them confirmed. I hired a private investigator, a professional, someone discreet. He followed Thomas, tracked his movements, and documented everything. I have the photos, the recordings, the evidence. And Max, it's not just Tammy, there are others." My jaw clenched involuntarily. I had expected to hear about Tammy's infidelity, but this was something else entirely. Sophie's revelation hit like a sledgehammer, shattering any remaining illusions I might have had about the situation. "Others?" I echoed, my voice betraying a hint of the anger simmering beneath the surface. Sophie nodded. "Yes, Thomas has been involved with several women over the years, all while maintaining his respectable facade. Tammy was just one of many. But she was different, Max. He became obsessed with her. It's why he's been so relentless, why he couldn't let her go." I stared at her, trying to process the information. Part of me wanted to believe that Tammy had been manipulated, that she had been a victim of Thomas's twisted games. But another part of me, the part that had seen the way she looked at him, the way she had lied to me, knew that wasn't the whole story. "And what do you want me to do with this information?" I asked, my voice laced with bitterness. "What good does it do now?" Sophie met my gaze, her eyes hard and cold. "I want you to understand that you're not alone in this, Max. We've both been betrayed, both been made fools of. But we don't have to sit back and take it. We can do something about it." I narrowed my eyes, sensing where this conversation was headed. "You're talking about revenge." "Justice," she corrected, her tone sharp. "Thomas Pryor has built his life on lies, and it's time those lies came crashing down. He thinks he's untouchable, that he can manipulate and control whoever he pleases. But he's wrong. He's vulnerable, Max, and with the right push, we can take him down." The intensity in her voice took me by surprise. I had always known Sophie to be calculating, but this was something different. This was personal. She wanted to destroy Thomas, and she was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. "I'm not interested in playing games, Sophie," I said evenly. "If you're looking for a partner in some elaborate scheme, you've got the wrong man." She tilted her head slightly, as if considering my words. "I'm not asking you to get your hands dirty, Max. All I'm asking is for you to consider the possibilities. You have a stake in this, too. Thomas Pryor didn't just hurt me. He hurt you, he hurt Tammy, and he's going to keep hurting people until someone stops him." I looked down at the table, my thoughts a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and a deep, gnawing sense of helplessness. Sophie was right. Thomas had to be stopped. But was I really the man to do it? Could I cross that line knowing that once I did, there would be no turning back? Before I could respond, Sophie reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table toward me. "What's this?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "Insurance," she replied cryptically. "Inside, you'll find everything you need to know about Thomas's extracurricular activities. Use it, don't use it, that's up to you. But keep it safe. You never know when it might come in handy. I hesitated for a moment before picking up the envelope. It felt heavy in my hand, not just with the weight of its contents, but with the implications of what it represented. This was more than just evidence. It was a weapon, one that could bring Thomas Pryor's carefully constructed world crashing down around him. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked, still wary of her motives. "Because I trust you," she said simply, "and because I know you'll do the right thing." With that, Sophie stood up, smoothing out her skirt as she prepared to leave. "Think about what I've said, Max. We both deserve justice, and sometimes the only way to get it is to take matters into our own hands." I watched as she walked out of the cafe, her posture as rigid and composed as ever. But even as she disappeared from view, her words lingered in my mind, echoing with a cold, unsettling truth. As I sat there, staring at the envelope in my hand, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could walk away from all of this, let the chips fall where they may, and try to rebuild what was left of my life. Or I could take the plunge, dive headfirst into the murky waters of revenge, and do whatever it took to make sure Thomas Pryor paid for what he had done. The decision weighed heavily on me, but deep down, I already knew what I would do. I had lost too much, suffered too many betrayals to simply walk away now. And if that meant crossing a line I had never crossed before, so be it. I wanted barbecue, so he arranged it at Bessinger's, west of the Ashley. I filled a takeout container with barbecue, ribs, and sides before finding an outdoor picnic table and asking a waitress for a pitcher of sweet tea. It might be a tough meeting, but at least I would enjoy my meal. Tammy arrived a few minutes later with a much smaller serving. I had to admit, if this had been a date, I might have felt different. She was dressed casually, but seemed to want to make an impression. What she didn't anticipate was how complicated my feelings were as I thought about us. I tried to hide a small smile at the sight of her. "Tammy, it's your time to speak," I said with a hush puppy in my mouth. She wasted no time. "I want to come home, Max," she said, waiting for my reaction. "I want to come home and try to recover what I foolishly and carelessly lost. I know it will be a difficult road, but I'm asking for that chance." She didn't realize it, but she just wanted to go back to the day everything fell apart and start over. I wasn't going to entertain that. I reached for the bottle of spicy sauce and squeezed some onto my plate. "Remember the Christmas party last year? The one where Jim kept holding mistletoe over every woman he could get close to, including you? He didn't act right, did he? I was thinking about that the other day. He knew where everything was in the house, even the bathroom on the second floor. You've been with him for a long time, and you think you have a tough road ahead?" I took a bite of my pulled pork sandwich and enjoyed the flavor as I waited for her to answer. It may sound casual, but she had already hurt me, and I had cried all the tears I could. I had other things I wanted to ask. "I want to know about Thomas Pryor. How did he get involved with you while you were with Jim?" Tammy looked like she was about to cry, but she held back her emotions. "Thomas was trying to manipulate me," she said quietly. "He saw Jim and me together one day after classes and said he would tell you. He even had us on video. I didn't want any of this. My situation with Jim was already too complicated, and then Thomas came along. I felt weak around him. He has a way with women. I can't explain it." "I understand what you mean, Tammy. It's about a dishonest partner, a year and a half of a dishonest partner. This was before that Christmas, right?" She didn't need to answer. I could see it in her eyes. I suspected the whole blackmail situation because I couldn't picture Tammy willingly getting involved with Thomas. "Tammy, I don't see how anything has changed from when we were in Vancouver. This meeting feels pointless to me." "Max, we've been together for over 20 years. You can't just throw it all away like this. Go have some fun. I know there are plenty of people who would be interested in you. I'll even give you a free pass, though I would hate every minute of it. We can't just let everything go to waste." She started to cry, still not understanding. I might have forgiven her if she had been honest right away. Instead, she kept it going for 6 more months. I told her I felt betrayed. She knew exactly what I meant. I felt betrayed right in my own home with the kids around. That was Jim's doing, wasn't it? I wouldn't be surprised if you used my pillow when he was here. It's just too much to accept. She didn't deny it. She just sat there crying, knowing it was useless. "Tell me, Tammy, Why did you ever get involved with him in the first place? You know the saying, curiosity killed the cat. What they said about him was true. I thought it would only happen once, but I was wrong. I could have been with so many others over the years, but I didn't. What she didn't say but meant was that once she started, she wanted more. I had no way of knowing how many there were or how many more there might be. That saying, absence makes the heart grow fonder, seems pointless in this situation. We looked at each other, knowing this was the end, and my appetite was gone. Just sadness after 20 years. She might have hoped I would wait for her to figure things out. Maybe she had, but I couldn't trust her anymore. I couldn't share any plans I might have other than knowing I wouldn't be there for her. Maximilian's Golden IPA on deck, he announced. Satch walked over. Is it over? I nodded and took a sip of my drink. It felt finished. Tammy signed the papers and we settled everything, making it official a few months later. Jim had moved on to Toronto. I heard he was keeping his distance from Tammy, but I tried not to care. Sophie Pryor divorced her ex-husband, and Thomas found a new place in North Charleston. Satch, have you ever thought about giving it all up and heading to that island you always dream about? Man, I think about it sometimes. But look at me. I've got my own place, all these people coming in here. I'm living my life, and I have my friends here to enjoy time with. He pointed to his saxophone in the corner. Then he flashed me a big smile. I'll get there someday, man. A round was bought for the regulars, and we headed out the door into the light rain. I rang the bell at the townhouse and heard footsteps coming. When the door opened, a young lady stood there, looking like a younger version of Kirsten. You must be Marlene, I said, extending my hand. Yes, Mr. Bunyan. Mama told me you would be stopping by today. Please come in. Please, call me Max. I followed her inside, leaving my bag at the door as she invited me to sit down. Having met many young ladies like her over the years, I had seen a range of beauty. Marlene was something special. Any man who caught her eye was very lucky. Mama said she would be back in time for lunch. She put tea in front of me and sat down opposite. She's been excited for days. Before long, the front door opened and Kirsten walked in, spotting us. Her father, Dennis, followed her. She hurried over and greeted me warmly while Dennis shook my hand. Lunch was nice, and after clearing the table, Kirsten and I sat in the courtyard enjoying a moment together before putting our bags in her car. Marlene was going to drive us to Frankfurt am Main and then continue on to Würzburg. The next morning at 10 o'clock, we picked up a rental car and drove to Castine on Penobscot Bay. Our flight had landed in Bangor, and it took about an hour to get to our destination. I had promised Kirsten a few months ago that I would take her to Down East Maine. With the changing leaves of fall around us and the pleasant weather, it was a great time to visit. I had rented a cottage for a week, and all we needed to do was buy some groceries and settle in. Mr. Bunyan, can I call you Max? Asked the important-looking man. Of course. I'll keep calling you Dean Gardner if that's okay with you, I replied. We both chuckled as the Dean of Maine Maritime Academy welcomed me into his office, which had a view of Castine Bay. I had run into an old friend who worked on a cruise ship, and he connected me with the dean. Now I was ready to finalize my teaching contract for engineering at the academy. After we shook hands on an agreement, I set off toward our rental cottage near the Dice Head Lighthouse. You did it, didn't you? Kirsten said when she saw my happy face. Of course, you didn't think I would fail, did you? I replied. That evening, we talked about our future. We each still had homes in different places, and I now had a part-time job in Castine. While sitting by Dice Head and looking out at the bay, Kirsten suggested, Why not out there? Well, the ferry only goes across the bay, not around here. I would have to take it to Lincolnville and then drive over an hour to get to Castine. I'd need my own boat to get here, I explained. You're a captain, Max. This should be easy, right? She looked at me as if amazed that I hadn't figured it out. That night, I looked for used boats online and found a couple that looked great, especially one. It used to be a lobster boat, but had been changed into a pleasure boat for an older couple. It had a rebuilt diesel engine with only 200 hours on it. A couple of days later, I bought it for $20,000. Kirsten found a nice house. It was a white cottage with a view of Castine and a short walk to a dock where I could rent a slip at a reasonable price. It wasn't cheap, but it had a nice garden and a tavern just a mile south. I paid a deposit, and the owner let me stay there until we closed on it. We were now official residents of Islesboro. In the following days, we got used to our new routine. I was teaching a 6-week class on pipe fitting for freshmen and overseeing some work being done on the TS State of Maine, our training vessel in the harbor. I'd be done before Thanksgiving, so Kirsten and I planned a trip to Charleston before heading back to Germany. Anson Street was busy with visitors and students as we strolled from the market. Satch suggested a friend to help manage the house while I was away, and the girls living there were quite responsible. I opened the door, and everything looked just as I had left it. I had made sure the girls knew they could use the downstairs if they kept it tidy, which they had, except for a pair of pajamas left at the bottom of the stairs, which I nudged with a smile at Kirsten. After a long travel day, we ordered Chinese takeout and shared a bottle of wine before calling it a night. The next morning, only one of the girls was in the house. The others had gone home for the holiday. We invited her to join us for Thanksgiving at Caroline's, a trendy restaurant off East Bay, along with Satch and a few friends. Everyone had a wonderful time, and when we invited the group back to the house, Satch and I relaxed on the front steps, enjoying a good cigar and some fine bourbon. Man, you know I was keeping an ear open for you. Did you hear your ex was causing trouble at the college? She claimed her boss did something wrong, and then a few other teachers had similar stories. It even made the news. People are saying he might quit or get fired. Really? That guy Pryor? I laughed as the smooth taste of the bourbon filled my mouth. Yeah, your ex isn't doing well either. She's been having a tough time since you two split. She was in my place about a week ago, upset and asking about you, then left a couple of hours later with someone else. That's been her pattern, Satch. She goes after the wrong type of attention. Honestly, I'm surprised she hasn't come to you, too. He looked at me with a slight surprise, then it clicked. She has, hasn't she? Wow, I chuckled. Did you go out with her? No way. You and I have been friends for too long for that. She's nice and all, but she's complicated. As long as you two are alive, she's still your wife, even if you're divorced. What about that great lady you're with now? Are you and Kirsten going to get married? Maybe it was the bourbon or the thoughts swirling in the air. I would marry Kirsten if we were in the right place, but right now, neither of us was on that path. We were both divorced adults who enjoyed our lives, and things were fun right now. Satch, I don't know. Maybe someday, but for now, I'm having a great time here in Maine and even over in Europe. It's working well as it is. Let's see. Tammy would try hard if you gave her the chance. Yeah, but she would need to step away from her current situation first. We both laughed, but it left a heavy feeling inside me. Tammy and I had talked through most things a while back, but the path she was on worried me. I didn't view love lightly. I had spent too many years treating it like something unimportant. It had been a while since I had driven to the small house by the Ashley River. The last time was when Tammy wanted to fix it up before her sister moved in after her marriage ended. Now, the sisters were living together. I waited at the door for a bit after ringing the bell before Patty came around the house with a small child in her arms. That was unexpected. Hi, Max. If you're looking for Tammy, she isn't here. That's fine. I was hoping to talk with you for a bit. Hey, I don't want to get involved in what happened between you two. I gently interrupted her. It's nothing like that. She's your sister, and I have some concerns from what I've heard. Patty looked away, biting her lip. I've heard she's not doing too well, and I'd like to help if I can. She invited me onto the patio and offered me sweet tea. She knows you've moved on, Max, and I think that's what set her off. I don't know what to do. She goes out every night and even started bringing people back home until I told her that wasn't okay with the baby around. Well, I want her to change something, and she'd know it would mean she'd have to stop drinking. I want her to be a caretaker for the girls living in the house. I have 4 girls staying there now, and I'm thinking of adding 2 more. I need someone responsible to check in on them. I thought you already had someone looking after the place? Patty asked, confused. I do, or at least someone to make sure bills get paid and repairs get done. But with so many students living there, it'd be nice for them to have someone to look in on them sometimes. I could see Patty thinking. We both knew Tammy wasn't dealing with a serious problem. This was her way of coping, and she needed a new focus for a while. What's the boy's name? I asked. She looked a bit surprised. Oh, I'm sorry, Max. I should have introduced him when you got here. This is Charlie. Long story, but I won't bore you. She tried to laugh, but struggled. I could only wonder. Patty agreed to speak with Tammy and have her call me if she was interested. It didn't take long for the call to come. The sisters had talked, and Tammy said she missed interacting with the girls now and then. She seemed a bit down about it, never mentioning specific names or asking for details. We set some basic rules: no drinking around the girls, no visitors in my house, and she had to register with the Dean of Student Affairs as an off-campus mentor. That last point was important. If she made a serious mistake, she could put her position at risk. She needed to control her actions. It didn't matter if she saw this as a way to stay close to me. She wouldn't be living in the house, and her visits would only be a couple of times a week. Besides, I'd be in Maine with Kirsten anyway. "You know you'll have to deal with her again sometime, right?" Kirsten asked me one evening before we flew back. "Maybe we'll see." The sky was a bright blue as we bobbed on the ocean waves. The little girl struggled to open the pot on the deck after I pulled it from the water, but her determination made me sit back and watch. Her face was focused, and with her gloves on, she opened the hatch and reached inside. I knew the creature inside probably didn't want to be caught, but she pulled it out and dropped it in the bucket with the others we'd caught earlier. We were about 100 yards off the dock, with my 8 buoys each holding a lobster trap below. The girl's mother stood on the dock, keeping a watchful eye on us. The little girl, Etta, waved to her mom as we headed back to the dock. Etta was named after Marlene's grandmother and Kirsten's mother, and at just 6 years old, she was bright and curious. "Be careful, Etta," Marlene called out. I lifted the girl from the boat, and she ran to her mother as I turned back to finish securing our things and getting ready for dinner. I paused at the dock, looking out to sea, with the far shore a mile away. I was back home, where I had spent my youth learning about growing up. Now, at 60, both Kirsten and I felt settled on Islesboro. She would turn 50 in the fall and still looked as lovely as when I first met her. We hadn't returned to Charleston since I sold my house on Anson Street a few years ago to the College of Charleston for use as off-campus housing. Tammy helped make that happen after she became the new department dean. She quit drinking and lives with her sister in West Ashley, helping to raise her nephew Charlie. According to Patty, she hasn't had a serious partner since we divorced. Satch sold Henry's house and invested some of the money in a bar in Key West, taking a younger woman along with him. I can't imagine him trying again, but they looked really happy when they were here last summer. It was a gentle summer evening when Kirsten and I walked along our country road to stop by the tavern for some drinks. We passed the community church and meeting hall at the north end. We both paused to look at it for a moment. "Do you think this will work?" I asked. "It doesn't have a tall tower, but it's white," she replied. Then we continued on our way to the tavern. Hey listeners, if you enjoyed watching this video and want to stay updated with our latest content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss out on what's coming next. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video with Queen Cheating Tales.